Thank you very much, Carolyn. And let me just get set up here. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I thank all of you for joining in this virtual meeting, this initiation of this year at the Institute of World Culture. It's an honor to be a part of it. And it's a joy for me to revisit the writings of Plato and the thought of Plato. And so this talk is called Nonviolent Leadership and Respectful Communication, Lessons from Plato's Gorgias. I'd like to begin with a quotation by Henry David Thoreau. This is from one of his letters to Harrison Blake. If words were invented to conceal thought, I think that newspapers are a great improvement on a bad invention. What if I told you I recently witnessed a fascinating discussion about the use and abuse of speech in public life? It went way beyond the tired partisan talking points of the news cycle. It really got me thinking in new ways about issues that affect us all: polarization, false debates, the nature of persuasion itself, its dangers when unmoored from facts and reason. But more, it reminded me that power resides in intimate, informal discussions, and that it takes real courage to engage in them. The discussion was penetrating in its wisdom, beyond, no surprise, anything encountered on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, or Frontline. Even as it displayed at times all the passion and lost tempers you might find on Crossfire. Full disclosure, I wasn't actually personally present at this conversation, but it came alive to me by reading a transcript, as it were. And while it shone a penetrating light on the issues I've mentioned, it made no specific reference to, say, the MAGA movement or social media, or even the recent US elections. It couldn't have, because the discussion occurred before 2016. In fact, a long time before, some 2,500 years ago. And it took place in Athens, Greece. I'm talking about Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias. The Gorgias is an inquiry into the nature of rhetoric. It is named after a famous sophist and teacher of rhetoric who appears in the dialogue. But most of the discussion is between Socrates and students of Gorgias, that is, Paulus and Callicles. This is significant in the light of Plato's intense interest in education and the responsibility shouldered by a teacher for his influence on his students, a theme that comes up more than once in the dialogue. The dialogue, it should be mentioned, was written shortly after the death of Socrates, who was accused falsely by the state of corrupting the youth. The sophists were hired by wealthy Athenians to groom their sons for public life, teaching them the ways and loopholes of government, the courts, and the aristocracy. Foremost in education was skill in oratory, how to speak convincingly, to gaslight effectively, to intimidate, impress, flatter, and manipulate. The great promise of an effective public speaking career was self-promotion and the protection of the interests of one's friends and supporters. Socrates was not a sophist. He was the self-described gadfly of Athens. He was an informal interrogator and conversationalist who, for decades, busied himself with testing the thinking of politicians, playwrights, and artisans. He was looking for traces of wisdom and its signature virtues of courage, justice, and temperance. He tested souls by testing arguments. Socrates was witty, blunt, affectionate, and relentless. Spectators found him amusing and enlightening. Public figures who valued image over character found him frightening and irritating. His notoriety eventually boiled over, and he was executed by the state on specious charges for capital offenses. The Athenian horsetail swatted the fly. Plato dramatizes Socrates' trial defense in the dialogue Apology. This is not our English word, meaning an expression of remorse for an offense. This is the Greek apologia, the formal name for the defense phase of a trial. The work is classed with Plato's dialogues, but it is really a monologue. Except for a couple of short responses by the prosecution under cross-examination, the speech is all Socrates. This sins against the Socratic spirit itself, which is speech in the service of an open-ended mutual search for truth. In other dialogues, Socrates is a philosopher who spontaneously falls into conversation as circumstances permit. The meetings are intimate and informal. The emphasis is thinking on your feet, shunning pat answers and shallow formulae, and accepting the ego risk that you may not have it all together and will be exposed. This use of speech stands in contrast to the sophists and rhetoricians, who taught, as I mentioned, public speaking skills to wealthy, ambitious aristocrats, who desired to learn the arts of persuasion. The powerful speaker was an enviable man, according to popular opinion. He could politically sway the Senate. He could launch a war. He could settle a personal score in the courts, or have an enemy punished at will. He could rouse a mob. But whether any of this was any good, and how, and for whom, well, that was the point of Socratic investigation. Gratification for Socrates was not the same as the good. Socrates was intensely interested in persuasion too, yet not by pathos, emotional manipulation, but by logos, reason. Socrates had faith that truth is self-validating because every soul is essentially a seeker after truth and directly recognizes and values the object of its quest. The soul must meet truth alone, without witnesses, without votes, without a jury's verdict. Socrates pointedly tells Paulus in the dialogue, the Gorgias, that he dismisses the notion that an opinion gains any weight by popularity or witnesses. Socrates is intent on one witness only, the interlocutor before him. As I said, he was testing men by testing arguments. This is brought home right at the beginning of the dialogue. Socrates arrives at the venue late and has just missed a quote unquote exhibition of rhetoric by the aging Gorgias. What disappointing timing. But perhaps, someone says, Gorgias can give Socrates a quote unquote display later at a friend's house. Socrates replies that he would much prefer a conversation, for he wants to find out how Gorgias accounts for his art and his role as a teacher. Oh, well, in that case, you're in luck, he is told, because Gorgias is welcoming all questions. Splendid, Socrates replies impishly to his escort and friend Chaerephon. Ask him, he demands. Chaerephon is dumbfounded. Ask him what? Who he is the terse and pregnant reply. Those three words are really the launch pad for everything that unfolds. When we consider, as we do today, speech, persuasion, dialogue, monologue, and the agora, the public space, the opening passage of Socrates' Defense, his apologia, is strikingly significant. Socrates alerts the jury, court officials, and the audience that he is not a public speaker. He has never been trained by any sophist or rhetorician in the manners and mechanics of the court. As the dialogue Gorgias points out, a man who does not pay his dues learning the games of public life will be at a tremendous disadvantage if the fates ever put him on the wrong end of a criminal case. Socrates is even accused by Callicles, the main interlocutor in Gorgias, of being foolish and unmanly for ignoring the challenges of public life, and instead spending his years whispering in corners the dainties of philosophy. Now, in court, on capital charges, Socrates' enemies hope his spirit will shrivel, and he will be humbled finally, finding himself on the losing side of someone else's game. Surely, they reckon, since his own habits of speech have gotten him in trouble, he will now attempt to speak otherwise. No such luck. Socrates announces that although he is a sort of fish out of water in this public forum, he will speak simply, plainly, and truly. And he will interrogate his accusers in the same way that he has always engaged discussions. He has nothing to hide. To the contrary, his accusers hide their motives and designs. Of course, as we know, Socrates fails to persuade the jurors and loses his life. But the record of his defense, thanks to Plato's account, has persuaded millions of readers across cultures, civilizations, and millennia. He has received the hearing he deserved in a much larger court. Persuaded them of what? Of the death of an innocent man? Yes. Of the tragic death of an irreplaceable public servant? Certainly. Of the hostility of public opinions towards inconvenient truth? Undoubtedly. But more, the persuasive power of Plato's writing combines wisdom, drama, and vivid characterization to stir soul memories, to motivate the reader to scrutinize his or her own internal life, to remind each of us of the incomparable value of being true to oneself. We don't ordinarily draw a connection between the ancient Indian virtue, ahimsa, harmlessness, which is the very soul of the nonviolent social movements of the 20th century, and the figure of Socrates interrogating a friendly inquirer, or a hapless public figure on the nature of virtue or the good life. And yet, if we pause to think about it, speech is intimately connected with nonviolence. Nonviolence is the renunciation of fearful modes of coercion, the giving up of the common practice in familial, civic, and international relations of seeking to get one's way by threatening the bodily safety, sovereignty, or property of another. According to the nonviolent philosophy of Gandhi, every indulgence in violence for the sake of short-term gain damages the good in the long run. It is only in the sunlight of open, defenseless, responsible relationships, that the flower of truth may bloom. And it is only through a disinterested pursuit of truth that a community can truly cohere and evolve through potentially destabilizing changes. The constructive evolution of a community is composed of and mirrored by the evolution of the individual, what Plato might call learning. Gandhi emphasized a distinction between relative and absolute truth. Logic requires us to distinguish between our mental models and the realities beyond our ken. Absolute truth is necessarily abstract and unknowable. But what does not make the notion, but that does not make the notion pointless and useless. Quite to the contrary. By positing a transcendental, unknowable truth, we gain a more realistic perspective on the limitations of our own ideas and opinions, which acts as a check on the passion of self-righteousness. If my opinions are at most relatively true, logically they must also be relatively false. It is up to me to hold fast to what I presently believe to be the case, even as I preserve an open mind about where I may be getting it wrong. The Socratic challenge, demonstrated in so many of the dialogues, is the willingness to have one's views tested and to openly admit ignorance when the argument dictates. As stated, Socrates was always testing the man by testing the argument, eager to find out if the walls are erected on a solid foundation, and the foundation rooted with deeply driven pylons. What was often revealed was personal vanity and shallow thinking. But with this also came the opportunity to learn. There's always room under the Socratic tent for learners. And there is never anything to fear. As he so often stated, to cherish a false opinion is as dangerous a condition for the mind as harboring disease in the body. And as the mind takes precedence over the body, a false opinion is more toxic than a bodily disease. Just as the individual must submit openly to the scrutiny and ministrations of a physician, so one ought to be willing to have one's soul examined and adjusted, if necessary, by a soul doctor. To be human is to disagree. This cannot be wished away. But dialogue offers an alternative to the ruinous course of violence, provided that the participants respect truth and summon a willingness to learn. Dialogue is not simply a forum, like a joint session of Congress, where alternating speech acts are performed and no one enters the room with any intention of listening or learning from anyone else. Nor is dialogue the formalized, televised, so-called debates between political candidates, which really excel at the dark arts of self-justification and mischaracterization of one's opponent. This is not free discussion by free men, but careful posturing by those who are enslaved by popularity and partisan funding. One of the pet themes in the Gorgias is the distinction between eristic, word fighting, and argument. We are cued into this by the very first words of the dialogue, in fact. Callicles greets the arrival of Socrates with a succinct assessment of a speech that both Socrates and we, the readers, have missed. Quote, "This is how they say you should take part in warfare and battle, Socrates." This sort of language comes up again and again. Rhetoric is valued as the weaponization of speech. The master orator speaks, quote, "against anyone he wishes, outshining and shaming anyone he wants." Gorgias, in describing his so-called art to Socrates, claims, "If a rhetorician and a doctor visited any city you like to name, and they had to contend an argument before the assembly or any other gathering as to which of the two should be chosen as doctor, the doctor would be nowhere. But the man who could speak would be chosen, if he so wished." The skilled rhetorician, quote, "competes with anyone he wishes for the minds of his listeners and wins every time. Because he sways the minds of men, he wields the most awesome of powers." Gorgias classifies rhetoric as a competitive art, like boxing or mixed fighting. But like those arts, cautions Gorgias, the possessor must show restraint. He must not strike his father or kill his kin just because he can. Quote, "The rhetorician," concludes Gorgias, "is competent to speak against anybody on any subject and to prove himself more convincing before a crowd on practically every topic he wishes. One must make proper use of rhetoric as of athletic gifts." In responding to these comments, Socrates displays a shrewd graciousness. He wishes to interrogate Gorgias, but at the same time, he knows that these masters of eristic can blow their tops when contradicted, especially in the company of acolytes. Is Gorgias willing to enter the territory of discussion with all its uncertainty and vulnerability? So I'm going to open my book here and read a passage here. This is how Socrates presents this. "I think, Gorgias, that, like myself, you have had much experience in discussions and must have observed that speakers can seldom define the topic of debate, and after mutual instruction and enlightenment, bring the meeting to a close. But if they are in dispute, and one insists that the other's statements are incorrect or obscure, they grow angry and imagine their opponent speaks with malice toward them, being more anxious for verbal victory than to investigate the subject under discussion. And finally, some of them part in the most disgraceful fashion, after uttering and listening to such abusive language that their audience are disgusted with themselves for having deigned to give ear to such fellows." Now, why do I say this? Because it seems to me that you are now saying, what you are now saying is not quite consistent or in tune with what you said at first about rhetoric. But I'm afraid to cross-examine you for fear that you might think my pertinacity is directed against you and not to the clarification of the matter in question. Now, if you are the same kind of man as I am, I should be glad to question you. If not, I will let it alone. And what kind of man am I? One of those who would gladly be refuted if anything I say is not true, and would gladly refute another who says what is not true, but would be no less happy to be refuted myself than to refute. For I consider that a greater benefit, inasmuch as it is a greater boon to be delivered from the worst of evils oneself than to deliver another. And I believe that there is no worse evil for man than a false opinion about the subject of our present discussion. If you then are the same kind of man as I am, let us continue. But if you feel that we should drop the matter, then let us say goodbye to the argument and dismiss it. And Gorgias says, no, I claim to be myself the type of man you indicate. This is one of the great pivots in the dialogue. As you've heard, Socrates was willing to walk away and let Gorgias alone. His approach is shrewd because Socrates is displaying a new kind of courage. Not the chest-beating, weaponized speaking style that Gorgias, Paulus, and Callicles are celebrating, but the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to be wrong, a glad willingness to be refuted if the argument so leads. How could Gorgias shrink from such an invitation and say that he is not that kind of man? Plato masterfully layers meanings here, creating a meta level. Socrates is inviting Gorgias to his method of nonviolent investigation by exhibiting the method through his invitation. Implicit in Platonic philosophy is the division of the interior life into a higher noetic aspect and a lower psychic nature, each with its own forces of persuasion. The psychic nature consists of the irrational influence of emotion, which can be activated and manipulated by threat or beguilement. The noetic aspect, on the other hand, is home of reason. It is developed through disciplined thought and respect for truth, and may be persuaded by rational appeal, or the influence of noble emotions, such as honor, awe, and reverence. True dialogue changes minds through honest appeal to truth and the willingness to be corrected. It is consensual, and there is no loss to anyone. In the Socratic world, correction is always a gain. Coercion, on the other hand, acts upon emotions and subconscious illusions. It may produce an appearance of conviction, but is this the same thing as a genuine change of mind? One crucial admission that Gorgias assents to is the distinction between belief and knowledge, and the difference between two corresponding forms of persuasion. Knowledge and belief cannot be identical, because there can be true and false belief, but there is no such thing as false knowledge. Anyone who knows or believes something has been persuaded to that knowledge or belief. There must be two skills, then, for bringing about persuasion. One produces knowledge, and that is instruction. The other produces belief without knowledge. And that, Gorgias admits, is the role of rhetoric. Stated starkly like this, it may appear to be identical with deception. But to be fair, a skillful rhetorician, as I said, may help convince a sick man to submit to surgery when the doctor himself had failed to do so. What was wanted was not instruction, but motivation by other means. In our present capitalistic democracy, persuasion by any means is fair. Plato, I think, accurately describes democracy as a flashy, colorful chaos. Equality descends into moral relativism, as any opinion is as good as any other. Democratic citizens practice democracy too within their souls, according to Plato. No desire is discriminated against, and each has its day or hour on the throne of the executive functions. This is justified as fairness and non-judgmentalism. But for Plato, it represents a lack of discrimination between the good and the meretricious. For us, the marketplace is the great democratic leveler. It is an amoral zone where everything has its exchange value. The origin of every sale is not money, but consent. If I can get your buy-in on my idea, what has the marketplace to care? If it has substantial value or if it is only a Trojan horse. A tendency to equate appearances eventually produces a world of only appearances. How can we ever agree on, quote unquote, the truth, while living in what some critics call a post-truth world? With the dawn of the deep fake, we cannot trust video testimony about facts. In that great democratic leveler called the internet, the con man and the expert stand side by side in presentation. To misquote Hamlet, nothing is true or false, but argument makes it so. There are facts and there are alternative facts. Is the vaccine helpful? You can find arguments. Is it harmful? There are plenty of arguments. And so with every other issue. And yet, in the Platonic dialogues, argument is sacrosanct to Socrates. Of course, what he practiced as philosophical argument and what we call argument are very different. We typically begin with the conclusion we want to reach, even if subconsciously, very often based on prejudice and egotism, and then select reasons to support that conclusion. And let's not forget the etymology of the word conclusion, con claudere, to shut completely. For Socrates, argument is a collaborative endeavor, an act of shared mutual mental construction. Every step is taken carefully and by consent of the interlocutors. A dialogue is two minds slowly walking together, perhaps clumsily, like two people tied together in a three-legged race. The aim is always the requirements of the argument, the integrity of the argument, not the personal positions of the participants. The argument, in other words, holds the promise of lifting the interlocutors outside of self and joining together in a shared interest. Logic carries objective necessity, superior to the relative necessity of divisive personal desire and the partiality of opinion. In other words, in assessing the truth of the Platonic dialogues, we don't just want to consider the content under discussion, like the doctrine of love in the Symposium, or the principles of the soul in the Republic. But the truthfulness if I may, of the method, wherever it may lead or not. Indeed, a number of the early dialogues end in aporia, uncertainty. The Charmides does not finally formulate a definition of temperance, nor does the Euthyphro gain definitive understanding of piety. It is as if the argument itself, as a shared activity, undertaken in an attitude of mutual respect and humility before the laws of logic, is a kind of reflection of transcendental truth. Truth cannot finally be captured or formulated, but its oneness may be mirrored in the integrity of the dialogue, the harmony of premises and conclusions, the common cause of the participants. It is not surprising then that in the Gorgias, there is so much emphasis on method of argument. Plato depicts Gorgias and his students as awkward and undisciplined in argument, even as they cherish their reputations as putative masters of oratory. One illustration of their difficulties comes with the transition of Gorgias' part in the conversation to Paulus's. In the Gorgias, there's a consecutive 3 interlocutors. So Socrates first has a brief discussion with Gorgias himself. That gets passed on to Paulus, and then a large portion of the dialogue goes to Callicles. The first thing to settle in a dialogue is the role you will fulfill. Who will ask questions and who will answer? Paulus elects to ask the questions, that is, take the executive leading role, but doesn't seem to grasp exactly what his role entails. He frequently gets derailed as he bristles at Socrates' responses, interrupting the chain of reasoning with outbursts of opinion. Socrates is trying gently, but frankly, to show Paulus that dialectic entails 2 levels. Participants must be mindful of both. The content under discussion, in the case of the example I'm about to read, it's whether the rhetorician always wields great power, and the method, content and method. Only through careful attention to method will the content become clear. Dialectical method is like a lens that must be ground and polished with great care if the image of truth is to be glimpsed. A form of impulsive speech with participants speaking past one another, invoking trite, emotionally charged conceptions, is nothing more than a kind of verbal food fight. After Socrates has presented his argument for why he views rhetoric as a branch of flattery and not an art at all, he invites Paulus to refute his views. And the following exchange takes place. As you will hear, by the end, Socrates does manage to pick the interest of Paulus, and he reluctantly relinquishes the role of questioner for the next phase of the argument. Paulus, what is it you say then? Do you hold that rhetoric is flattery? No, I said a part of flattery. Can you not remember at your age, Paulus? What will you do when you are older? Do you think then that good rhetoricians are considered but poor creatures in cities because they're flatterers? Is that a question or the beginning of a speech? It is a question I'm asking. Well, In my opinion, they are not considered at all. How are they not considered? Are they not the most powerful in their cities? No, if by power you mean something good for its possessor. I do mean that. Well, then, in my opinion, rhetoricians have the least power of any in the state. What? Do they not, like tyrants, put to death any man they will, and deprive of their fortunes, and banish whomsoever seems best? By the dog, at every word you utter, Paulus, I am puzzled as to whether you are speaking for yourself and expressing your own views, or questioning me. I am questioning you. Well, my friend, then you ask me two questions at once. Oh, what two questions? Did you not say just now, do not orators put to death whomsoever they will, and deprive of their fortunes and banish from the state whomsoever it seems best? I did. Then I claim that there are two questions here, and I will answer both. I say, Paulus, that orators and tyrants have the very least power of any in our cities, as I stated just now. For they do practically nothing that they will, but only what seems best to them. Well, is not that to possess great power? No, indeed, according to Paulus. According to me? Indeed, I affirm that it is. You do not, since you said that great power was a good for its possessor. So I do say, do you call it good then if a man without intelligence does what seems best to him? Do you call this great power? Not I. Then refute me and prove that orators have intelligence, that rhetoric is an art and not a form of flattery. But if you leave me unrefuted, then the orators who do what seems good to them in our cities and the tyrants will possess no benefit herein. For power, as you say, is a good. But you too admit that to do what seems good to you without intelligence is an evil. Did you not? I do. Then how can rhetoricians and tyrants possess great power in our cities, unless Paulus proves against Socrates that they do what they will? This fellow. I deny that they do what they will. Now refute me. Did you not just now admit that they do what seems best to them? Yes, and I still admit it. Then are they not doing what they will? That I deny. When they do what seems best to them? Yes. What you say is shocking and fantastic, Socrates. No need to offend, Paulus, my friend, to address you in your own style. But if you have any questions to ask me, prove that my view is false. If not, answer yourself. Well, I'm willing to answer, if only to learn what you mean. So this passage, as you've heard, comes on the heels of Socrates' view that rhetoric is not an art at all, but only a form of flattery. Many readers consider this Socratic thesis to be the very heart of the Gorgias. Let's look together at it with the help of a sequence of slides. And I'm going to try now to share my screen with you and do a slide share. And Bob Morris, somebody will tell me if I'm successful. How do we do, Bob?
I'm seeing it. Body, soul.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Looks good.
So, there is this very important point in the dialogue where this main thesis comes out that Socrates presents. in his discussion with Paulus, he says, as you've heard, that he doesn't consider rhetoric to be an art at all, but only a kind of routine. And this deserves some analysis. So first of all, we admit that there's a difference between body and soul. So there's body and soul. And let's see if we can, the slides are not advancing. Okay. I love that. Don't you love this? This always happens. Okay, so why wouldn't they be advancing? Oh, maybe they were advancing before. Okay, I'm going to just get out of here for a moment. Hold your horses. Let's see if that activates it. Screen share. Just like oh, okay. Oh, okay, I can do it that way. Okay, fine. All right, I think we're okay now. Okay, there we go. First of all, he has, there's the admission in the argument of the existence of the body and the existence of the soul. And that there's an art of health that is integrity and welfare for both of these. And by art, he doesn't mean our sense of the fine arts, but he means much more what we would mean in the sense of a science, of a rational understanding and of a careful knowledge. So for the body, there is what he says, gymnastic and medicine. So, which of course he means exercise and nutrition. Straightforward. But there also is for the soul two corresponding arts as well. And those are legislation and justice. Now these seem like political terms, so it seems a little strange maybe at first to see him talking about the soul as these are the two arts of the soul. But remember, as in the Republic, there is a reflection between the microcosm and macrocosm. And it's easy to understand that by legislation, he means, just like in the macrocosm, we have in the city, we legislate, we make up rules and laws and constitutions as guiding principles for behavior, as safeguards with laws and sanctions to protect the greater good, ideally. Justice is a remediation, is when legislation fails, justice rebalances that. So also in the soul, the thoughtful, the individual, the person who is on the quest of self-knowledge will be sifting and selecting principles and ideas that are their legislation, their founding principles to live by. And where they fail to live by these principles, where their loyalty or their will fails, there is justice, there is balance. And in the Platonic view, it is something like the Hindu idea of karma. There is general natural law, there is internal law, as well as external sanctions. Now, so this is what the eye should be pointed to for someone who is searching for the good. They should understand that what the good is for the body and what is the good for the soul. However, there is also, there's always the Platonic distinction between truth and appearance. between reality and semblance. So also there is art or science is mimicked by what Socrates calls flattery. He says it's not a science, but it's a routine. That is, it's learned by empirical experience. There are no guiding principles, and it's mostly led by pleasure. So rather than the true health of the body, flattery comes up with its arts. So instead of the exercise of gymnastic, there develops this routine of beautification. So how to apply cosmetics or how to dress in such a way as to look healthy, even if you're not. And in substitute for a proper knowledge of nutrition, there develops cookery. So, dedicated to the pleasures of the palate only, with no regard as to what the body needs or not. And there are two for the soul as well. There's sophistry and rhetoric. And so sophistry mimics legislation. It, rather than coming up with essential principles, it manages to rationalize, and it would represent what we see if we're to follow the method of the Republic and try to understand ourselves looking at the city. It would reflect us looking at the antics of lawmakers and the kinds of laws they institute for short-term interests or for in terms of partiality. So also we do that with ourselves, rather than sifting and finding fundamental principles and truths, which can be painful or difficult to stick by or to test ourselves by. We rationalize and come up with substitutes for these, which are really fake. They're really forms of flattery or concession for our weaknesses. And then we come to rhetoric. So rhetoric is only a part of this routine of flattery. Rhetoric, he has down as imitating justice, but without really being justice. Why does he do that? Well, because the rhetoricians were sought after in the courts of law. So when things have gone astray for someone up high, they get an attorney. This is the same as the way that we frequently characterize the attorney and the practice of law. So the rhetorician is a kind of a skilled liar, someone skilled in deceptions and excuses, and is needed. Therefore, he can sway the courts in his own favor or in the favor of his family. He can punish enemies unjustly. So this sort of scheme is what is at the basis of, at the very heart of the dialogue, and is Socrates, I think, a rather compelling thing to contemplate. Socrates' template for us trying to understand abuses of public oratory. So, stop sharing here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we're going to go pretty soon here to discussion, and I look forward to what you have to say. What I've presented today is not any kind of comprehensive discussion of that incredible dialogue. It's about 80 pages long of the Gorgias, but only a sort of response in view of the topics that the Institute has chosen. I didn't choose to go in here with the two main theses in the dialogue, which are argued very rigorously. One of them centers on the discussion with Paulus about how the Socratic premise is to do wrong is the greatest of evils. It is worse to do evil than to suffer evil unjustly. And then there's the theme that underlies his discussion with Callicles, which is that the temperate life is the good life, not the life of the libertine. The dialogue is full of humor and absurdity. And if we frequently speak of Socratic irony, the dialogue really has a lot of Socratic perversity. He himself turning things completely on their head, a common notion. So the rhetoricians are arguing for the power of rhetoric to, promote self-interest and to escape punishment. And Socrates, by leading them along, eventually comes to these absurd conclusions that, well, if there is a proper use for rhetoric, it should be to argue for your own punishment in the courts of law. And if you really want to harm your enemies, what you really want to do is argue that they get off scot-free if they are guilty of any kind of injustice. Because from the Socratic standpoint, there's no one more miserable than the unjust man. There's nothing worse than sickness of soul. And so this is argued in wonderfully entertaining and clever ways. But it really does, he's turning the whole thing on its head. And also there's the interesting question about, is Socrates himself a kind of rhetorician? And what about Socratic rhetoric? Plato is also pointing to that in this dialogue. He has, whenever the argument whenever Socrates addresses the new interlocutor after the previous one has failed, the new interlocutor does an assessment of what happened just now. So when he comes to Paulus, right, Paulus gives a quick rhetorical analysis of what Socrates had just done, just to show him that I'm really on to you. I see what you did with your argument. And then the same thing recurs when Callicles comes on. Callicles gives this long explanation of what Socrates has really done, that Socrates confuses what we call conventional good with natural good. And he's always, instead of talking about conventional, natural power, he convinces with conventionality. Anyway, Socrates is doing this kind of quick swap, and this is what Callicles is convinced of. What's very funny in the case of the switching over to Callicles is that Callicles initially begins with like 3 thick pages of argument. So he kind of hogs the stage, which is what Socrates is always trying to get them not to do. He wants them to speak in brief, to give quick answers. And after giving this long assessment of what Socrates has done and why Socrates is completely wrong-headed and why philosophy is completely wrong, but why any man who persists in philosophy past his youth should have his ears boxed. After all of that, then Socrates, in like a half a page, as he begins the argument, runs Callicles aground, and Callicles starts gaslighting. Anyway, there's a lot of humor to all of this, but it does bring up the interesting question is, you see that Socrates is shrewd. There is something of the rhetorician to Socrates, and he does at times want to rescue the notion that there is a proper use for rhetoric. But it must come, from the good soul, and it must be aimed for the common good. There's also his important argument against libertinism that Callicles puts out. Callicles is sort of like a figure like Thrasymachus is in the Republic. He bursts onto the scene, and he wants to celebrate that the most enviable man is the most powerful man. He can always get what he wills. He can overpower anyone. He's accountable to no one, and his desires are at full bore, and he has the full capacity to satisfy those desires. And Socrates is starting to say, well, isn't temperance a good? And Callicles will have none of it. No, temperance is not a good at all. It's for stones and acorns. It's something inert and stupid. And so Socrates says, well, I've heard this metaphor of, it's given to us by a Sicilian poet or something about, where he says where the soul is like a jar, and, the contented man is like someone who has really sound jars in his pantry and therefore has his honey stored and has his milk stored and he's very content to know that these things are safely stored. But the person who has insatiable desire, who is under the pressure of insatiable desire, he's like somebody with unsound jars, and they're always leaking. He's always checking his stores, and he has to go and refill them again. So insatiable desire is like this. And Socrates says, now, doesn't this convince you of the beauty and the desirability of temperance, Callicles? And Callicles keeps doubling down on his answers. Like, he sees he's getting cornered, but he keeps going. And he says, no, because no, it doesn't. I think that to have the fullest of desires all the time and the full ability to satisfy them is really what is needed. And I don't want to be your piety is, leave that for weak men, for weaklings. I'm after the robust life. And so Socrates starts saying, well, so do you believe pleasure is the good? And Paulus says, Callicles says, absolutely. Pleasure is identical with good. All pleasures with the good. All desires are good. And then Socrates eventually says, well, what about if you have an itch and you have the desire to scratch it? You would say that somebody who could never satisfy that itch would be the supremely happy man. And Callicles, says that, oh, Socrates, aren't you ashamed of yourself? He starts gaslighting. Aren't you ashamed of yourself to bring it to that level? And he goes further. So, Socrates is constantly celebrating Callicles as the most shameless of the interlocutors he's spoken with that day, because he feels that, as long as you're going to go whole hog, do it. And I will too. And let's see where this leads. And whereas it's clear that Gorgias and Paulus sort of dropped out when they were sort of ashamed at where their premises were leading. So I suppose just in conclusion, I would say, reviewing this dialogue again, which is such a wonderful thing to read, speech is indeed a powerful means for transformation. That transformation can be either learning and growth, or it can be corruption and decay. Which it will be is never wholly dependent on external safeguards. For Socrates, the key lies in the individual, in his hunger for wisdom, in his willingness for self-examination. One thing seems certain coming away from the Gorgias. If speech is a magical medicine or goddess, where is its clinic or temple? Not in the public forums and assemblies, not in the chat rooms or popular news programs. The jar for holding this elixir is the intimacy of small gatherings, where honest, open, earnest discussion may flourish. This is not the leaky jar of insatiable desire for likes and clicks and external reinforcement, but it is the jar of true contentedness. It also includes the intimacy of the reader communing with minds like Plato's. We need to tie our sails to these solid posts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. At this point, we can take up people's comments and questions. So if you remember, there is a place on your Zoom face for raising your hand. And like Steve Bird did just now. So that would be the preferable way to ask a question. But Steve, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Steve?
Has to unmute himself.
No, he's not muted. For some reason, we can't hear you, Steve, even though you're not muted. Okay, you're just not coming through. Sorry about that. So until that problem is fixed, we'll move on to another question from me temporarily. Joe, I think that you've kind of answered this question, but is the problem with like Callicles, he doesn't believe in soul, I take it. That a lot of people would say, if you don't believe in soul, it just doesn't matter that the gratification of your desires is the supreme good. So does Socrates have an argument against that other than the itch?
Okay, well, does Callicles believe in soul? I think, I believe the word that's used in Plato is psyche, is psyche. And, the thing about these Socratic dialogues is it's not necessarily a metaphysical soul. It's an existential soul. It's to call attention to the inner life, it's sort of a word for mind and heart and attitude and motivation. And so in that regard, certainly Callicles believes in soul, believes in some kind of inner life. But whether it should take precedence or whether there is an art to perfecting it, that he wouldn't agree. He hasn't seen that. He's of the ilk that whatever there may be of the inner life of thought, will, feeling, motivation, and all that, it's to serve the gratifications of the outer life. So so the outer life takes precedence. It's more real. And it's the same, I think it's the same, what you're talking about is the same distinction made in philosophy between, say, the materialist and the idealist. The idealist looks at the body as a temple for the mind or for the inner life, that bodies come about because the soul needs experience. And if you look at all the senses and faculties, you recognize that there's some core, some living consciousness, some living attentive core to it. If you talk to your children, you're not talking to their bodies, you're not talking to their neurons, you're talking to them. You're talking to the mind and the soul. So there's this, even a materialist who's going to argue in his research, some philosopher, some determinist who's going to argue in his research that there's no such thing as free will, is going to teach his children morality and is going to be glad that there are, there's a justice system that holds people responsible. So existentially, he will believe in the soul too, even though theoretically he's disconnected.
Okay, thank you. Jerry Kiffey?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. This is an incredibly timely topic, isn't it? I want to turn your attention to, it's not entirely current events, because I think this problem is kind of, perpetual, but it seems particularly acute at this time. It seems the whole idea of democracy, at least to me, is predicated on the idea of persuasion. I mean, in the end, you have to vote. And to gain power or influence, you need to hold an office. To hold office, you have to acquire votes. To get someone to vote for you or for your cause or whatever it might be, you have to persuade them to do so. So my question has to do with the power and the art of persuasion. And when we think about like the different ways that persuasion is engaged, we get repetition. So you take your point of view or your idea and you just say it over and over and over and over again, so many times, whether it's true or false. And at some point, someone may or many may come to believe you. Then you get the idea that you're persuaded because the majority of people think that it's true. And that's another strategy for persuasion. Another one is to get celebrities or influencers of different kinds, or even one's close family members, one's father or mother that one respects. You know, if they believe or say something, then you're in, it's more persuasive than if someone you don't like says so. And then lastly, maybe, you know, because an expert of some sort, a doctor, says that this is good or bad. What would Socrates say are the proper components of genuine persuasion?
Yeah, good analysis, good survey. Well, you know, the dialogue directly addresses that. You know, Socrates, his interlocutors are bringing up, Paulus especially at this, brings up the whole notion. He's always quoting, you know, well, this is what everyone believes and everybody thinks this. And you know, everyone knows that the tyrant has the best life. And Socrates keeps coming down. He's really taking swipes at democracy. It's no secret that Plato wasn't a fan of democracy, and nor was Socrates. There's in the Republic, there's that sequence of the decline of the state from the aristocracy, the rule of the best, the truly best would be the ideal situation, to oligarchy, you know, the rule of wealth, and then that is eventually there's revolution as the sinewy masses can rise up against the fat, lazy, wealthy, and take back the state. And then democracy, then democracy rules, which is what his belief that it's a loss of discrimination, that you can no longer see what is best, what is not. Everyone is equal, all opinions are equal, all emotions are equal, all desires are equal. So everything has to have its day. And so in the Republic, it's described as this, you know, a flowery, it's like a beautiful, showy, flowery dress that has lots of variety to it. There's no unity, no integrity. It's very unstable. And then, of course, that eventually slides into tyranny, he says. So that's a sequence he argues for. But when he's to the interlocutors, there was one of the passages I read where he says, where Socrates, during his argument to Paulus, says, oh, well, to one response to Paulus, oh, not according to Paulus. And he does the same thing to Callicles in a discussion with him. He says, oh, not according to Callicles. He's wants only the assent of the person before him. He says, I'm only after one vote, the person I'm talking to right now. It doesn't matter. I know in your courts, you bring all these witnesses to support your view. I know in your democracy, you have all these votes. That's not the way of truth. The way of truth can only come through knowledge, and knowledge is a steep path to climb. So what you say is true, that we become it's very good. These are all studies of, you know, not of noetic persuasion, but of psychic persuasion, that mere repetition, mere habituation suddenly makes something true, you know, or the opinion of the many, or the opinion of the expert, or the opinion of the celebrity, or one's mother's opinion. Yes, we are swayed by all these things, but we're swayed by all these things, frankly, because we are not anchored to truth. We're not anchored to truly seeing and thinking it through ourselves. So, Socrates is such a study of this that he's also saying in the dialogue frequently, look, especially as he's talking to Callicles, and Callicles is changing once he's run into a cul-de-sac in the argument, he says, okay, I didn't really mean that. Okay, because everyone knows when I said that back then, I really meant this. And Socrates says, okay, well, you're changing all the time, but philosophy itself doesn't change. So that whole changeableness. So, it's an act of faith for us, because what Socrates is pointing to is not something popular, it's something we normally understand. he's talking about a kind of, self-knowledge and grounding oneself to a method of investigation and thinking things through, where one becomes impervious to these other influences. And, he made himself unpopular by like taking a stick to the walls of an old house and poking them to see if there's rotten spots. Well, that's what he was doing to everyone in Athens, which he thought was a genuine good. Do you want to say anything else, Gary?
Bob, how do I raise my hand?
We'll
I
let
yield the
you
floor to
speak,
Phil.
And then we'll take up Judy's question.
Yield the floor to.
Okay. But still, how do you raise your hand?
Oh,
Down at the bottom.
it's down at the bottom. Of
It's the
your-
reactions button, Phil.
The reaction button? Well, can I talk now?
Yeah.
Well, you've
Okay.
stolen the floor already.
I'm sorry. In the Republic, towards the end, Socrates says of Thrasymachus and to the fellows around them, he says, can't you see that Thrasymachus and I have now become friends? And the implication I always took from that was that if you're talking to somebody, you have to first of all convince them that you're on their side, namely characterized in some sense in clarifying issues and getting at the truth. But most of the arguments that we can get into these days are with ideologues, whether it's a libertarian or it's a socialist or it's a right-wing Christian fundamentalist or very conservative Catholic over serious issues. And I guess my question is, if I want to talk to one of those folks about a serious issue that they hold dear to themselves, and they don't regard themselves as a sophist of some kind, what's the best way to do that?
That's the greatest question, I think, coming out of this dialogue. That's really the challenge.
Because if you're just challenging someone's ego, you're not going to get any place. On the other hand, if you just agree with them, you're dismissing them and patronizing them. So it is in many cases just impossible to have a serious discussion with someone. You might even love them, but they don't want to examine the basic premise of their life. If it's religious or political or something like that. And I just and we all have friends like that we just reach points where we just can't discuss things with them anymore. Whether I was Socrates or not, I'm not going to get in most cases, a fundamentalist right-wing Christian to acknowledge perhaps some things that I might want them to, or a really conservative Catholic or a libertarian. They fall back to whatever is the foundation of their whole belief system in that regard. And there's very little chance of getting to them, even as a friend. I don't know whether that's a comment or a question. Yeah.
And yet, I feel like, for me, coming away from reading this dialogue again, it's the challenge to engage, not shirk.
Right.
The challenge to engage, because I always take the easy path. I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not going to. And yet I think Socrates was not that. He was engaging at every opportunity, and I love that what you brought up about that he calls Thrasymachus a friend, and you do see this again and again, his supreme graciousness to all of these people he's talking to, and often saying my friend, and it's so that, I think when I enter into conversations, if I'm, often it happens in business, if I'm in somebody's house and, they are a political or religious ideologue of a certain kind, I sometimes will enter into conversations with them without any desire to publish any positions of my own, but simply to talk with them and find some concord with with some, with some aspect of their thinking. I mean, I really believe logically that what is relatively true is also relatively false, and therefore what is relatively false has relative truth in it.
So you can start with something like, don't you think we should be kind to our children, and try to go someplace from there?
Well, I mean, if somebody is pointedly, asking me if I've accepted Jesus as their savior, I might point out to them that, rather than, I might point out to them that, gosh, I really enjoy reading parts of Matthew's gospel, the Sermon on the Mount. It's really compelling to me, that whole notion of turning the other cheek or doing good to those who are evil, and that kind of, divine trust of be like the lilies of the field. Don't you? I find that really moving. I might go there, so, and I don't have to say I'm interested in other religious thought as well. I think that, or it could go with a conservative. After all, I think, one of Emerson's essays, the conservative and the progressive, they're like 2 feet of a walking man, anyway, it's a super good question, because I think that's the bottom line. I come away with this is an imperative to engage, and then to try to bring a graciousness, try to communicate, as you say, I'm on your side. I'm not trying to get something from you. I'm not trying to humiliate you. I'm not going to ridicule your positions.
Without being patronizing.
Without being patronizing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to ask Judy, then try Steve Bird again, and then Nancy, Maurice, and Carolyn. So Judy, what do you have a comment, question?
Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, everybody has to unmute when they talk.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Joe, excellent talk. You really understand Plato much better than the philosophy professors I studied with. But I think there's one
I learned it taking draperies.
Yes, there's one grave misunderstanding of Plato which exists among many academics, no matter how learned. And even Karl Popper thought Plato was something of a fascist because he doesn't like democracy. But what I think he doesn't like is mob rule, because it's the closest thing a tyrant can appeal to, and appeal to what everybody in the mob wants. Whereas what I think he meant is that the philosopher king would be the highest form of rule if everyone were educated to look for the truth as they should be. Then each of us would himself or herself be a republic. And there's also an argument in the republic that the tyrant is 720 times more unhappy than the philosopher king. I can't remember how he arrives there, but it's a mathematical argument. It's very interesting. So I don't think Plato was a fascist, but what the totalitarian tyrant does appeal to would be all these arguments that a certain politician, I don't need to name, uses all the time, ad hominem, like what someone looks like, ad baculum, oh, what I'm going to do to you to hurt you, or ignoratio elenchi, change the subject. So could you please elaborate more on the idea that, I mean, democracy, if it were truly Republican in the form of educated electors and an educated government, I think is not the worst form of government, if we could truly reach it with everyone having reason ruling. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. I guess, coming straight off of the influence of Plato, I haven't put on my democratic shoes yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny when we do have this knee-jerk reaction to aristocracy because we have trust issues,
Mm-hmm.
and we have limited imaginations. I mean, but it's funny, we want to say anyone can be president, and yeah, we could have, con men and failed businessmen, TV reality stars become president. But you know, think about, I mean, in an organization, in organizations, we celebrate aristocracy, don't we? We don't call it that, but you know, the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, thank heavens, Wynton Marsalis presides over that. I mean, what an extraordinary intellect, historian, amazing musician, composer. Yeah, you want someone like that in charge of that. He's not the same as the others. He's different. He's superior. So we don't, you know, we don't want to say this because you know, of personal insecurity, if, you know, we believe if somebody, if we really admire the superior qualities of someone else, it takes something away from us. You know, it's also, we're metaphysically sloppy because we confuse the metaphysical notion, like, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. That's a metaphysical statement about what's at the core of every individual. It takes a metaphysical view to understand that. It doesn't mean everyone is the same, you know, in abilities or the same in appearance, but it means everyone is entitled to the same regard and the same equal regard under law. It's that kind of thing. So we get, you know, we're not really clear about that. So that's why we get so offended by, you know, and then Plato also wants to say, of course, we're in love with our sloppy thinking and our enslavement to various desires and passions, and we don't want to question those. So we, you know, he says in the same way that democracy in the soul gets writ large into the larger democracy. But you know, of course, Plato's just one view of the matter, and there's much that could be said, and other people could say it better than me, about the opportunities and values that democracy represents for, you know, greater development of the soul and a person's abilities, that don't happen in, you know, in a heavy theocracy that, you know, keeps women covered, for example, and doesn't promote equal education, you know, or other forms of tyranny that are, you know, that create unspeakable hardships and difficulties for people and limit their minds and limit the expressions of their abilities. So, you know, yes, I would much prefer the free-for-all where somebody can, you know, can have the opportunity to express themselves.
Thank you. Nancy Martin, you have a question or comment?
Okay, I just had a comment that the way to deal with people of all types, religions, philosophies, is just to acknowledge that you hear them and you're listening and you respect them. And you don't have to agree with them. You just have to let them know that you hear them. That's it.
Wonderful. Yeah, exactly. And this notion, you know, this Socratic humility.
In about half an hour.
Can somebody mute Phil? I don't have control over this, you know, the Socratic humility to hold, you know, requires some kind of spaciousness of soul to hold your present opinions and your present convictions in a larger space where, you know, they're not absolute, they're not sacrosanct, they're not the last word, that there may be evidence coming around the corner that they need to be revised and changed, that you are a learner. That's really important. And I think that's implicit in what Nancy's saying. The moment, you know, when we really listen to another person, we're implying, we're respecting them by saying that you know, if I hold different opinions, then my opinions aren't the last word. But there's room at the table for you. Everyone wants to be heard in that way. Thank you.
Maurice or Jenny?
Hello.
Hi, Jen.
So can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I wanted to have a clarification. I was following you, Joe, when you were talking about, yes, there's a body and a soul and Socrates' discussion, and that there's a science or art, say, of legislation was the term you used. So, but if that's not what we're seeing sophistry. And then, so I'm trying to understand what we see when we see a lot of kind of the theory of conspiracy in politics, that's an explanation. Is that an excuse? Because you said sometimes you're seeing excuse or deception. And if we give the benefit of the doubt, no one's necessarily trying to deceive. Are they trying to make an excuse in kind of holding on to the conspiracy theory of politics?
Yes, so right so Socrates is proposing, just a little recap, that there is an art or a science to a healthy, sound body, which is the good at the physical level, but there's also the good for the inner life, the life of thought, will, and feeling, of attitude and emotion, and so there's a discipline for that, and that's what he's pointing out, what he calls legislation and justice, and so, and that would at a macro level, it means the instituting of laws and the sanctions and law enforcement for preserving those laws and supporting them, and then punishing or deviations from that. But I think that's interesting what you're saying, Jenny. That's right. So he says there's in lieu of that, there are imitations that fool us, and so instead of really instituting sound principles or laws, we have deceptions going on and rationalizations, and we have positions that are with the revolving door democracy. One of the problems of the election cycle and all that is it's like remember the kiosks at when you were a university student, and you'd have a handbill for this event, and then a handbill for that event on top, and then another handbill for another one stapled, and you get a layer of 20 of these things. And these are the lasting laws of democracy. Lawmakers get elected, and then they do their own thing, and that gets plastered on, and it's really not for the good of the whole, but for it has pork in it, and it's meant to provide meet the wants of their partisan funders, etc. So that would be sophistry, and at a soul level, Plato's inviting us to say, yeah, we do that too within ourselves. We rather than yoking ourselves to carefully sifted and sound principles, we come up with routines, which we might call principles, but they're not. And so, yeah, conspiracy theories, yes, I suppose you could, that is right. A person is structuring their life around a set of thoughts and ideas that it's not really clear. Are they yoked to truth? Well, often they're yoked to resentment and the power of anger. This is the great opiate of the people. It isn't, religion now isn't the opiate of the people, as Marx said, but anger is the opiate of the people. Outrage is the opiate of the people. So, we had 25 years of a certain unnamed radio newscaster who served up a dose from his pulpit daily of outrage and created distortions so people would experience outrage. And I remember there was a telling moment, there was George Bush Jr.'s campaign manager was this rascal named Lee Atwater, who died in his 40s from a brain tumor. But he wrote a letter to the American people that was published in Life magazine when he was on his deathbed. And Lee Atwater said that he was Karl Rove's teacher, and so he started this distortion and outrage and incredibly contentious politics of polarity. He was one of the architects of that. And he said in his letter, I'm profoundly disturbed by what I've done for my culpability in this. This is really wrong. And this is what got me. He said, we are manipulating the spiritual vacuum in the American heart. So where there is not, where there's not genuine affirmations of the good, where there's not real knowledge, where there's not a sense of what Socrates has presented, an art of the inner life, where that is absent, we are vulnerable for infection, where there's no vaccine for this. We're vulnerable for infections of exaggerated emotions that takes the place of and fills the spiritual void. And outrage is the thing for sale. And yes, we've just had a president, the previous president, who was marketing the outrage that had been, harvested for decades, So, yeah, I think that does fall under the sophistry in that chart.
Okay, thank you.
Carolyn, you have a question, comment?
I want to go back to Phil's question about how do you communicate with intense ideologues and religious fanatics, etc. I think we've seen one way, in addition to all the nice things you said, and try to build up trust and all that, don't get into arguments, but suffering. If you watch someone you love die of COVID and they weren't vaccinated and they, were full of this anger, and why didn't God protect us? You might get some fresh thinking. They might get some cracks in their armor, and maybe it's confusion and all of that. But it does seem, despite where we're at now, seemingly, paralyzed, it does seem that suffering is a good way to dent the armor and have people raise questions and all of that. Secondly, another way is to just kind of hold on, be a friend, but it can take time. I know somebody who's been trying for 30 years to get me to take Jesus as my Lord and Savior. She thinks it's her duty to do that, and very frustrated that I won't, and worried about my future. But it nonetheless, with interactions here and there, it took 30 years, but out of her experience with life and all, she one day just gave a summary of what she understood about karma. And I sat there quiet but astonished, because she had thought out for herself, not reading a book, not going to some church or lodge or whatever. She had thought out a very complex, and from my point of view, totally accurate notion of karma. So she was actually beginning to use that idea to, make sense of life and the world and all of that. So it may be patience, and who knows, it might be 10 lives from now before somebody gets a new idea. But I think the suffering and the patient reconsideration or discovery of true ideas are ways in which you crack the armor.
Thank you.
Because of time constraints of people involved in this broadcast, I'm going to ask right now for our one of our members to give a vote of thanks for the Institute, for Joe Miller. And then we have a few closing comments. And then after all that, if Joe wants to stick around and take more questions, we can. But would Jim Teffer please give a vote of thanks for the Institute?
Oh, yes, it would be a pleasure to do that. Can you hear me, folks? I want to be sure because I've had a problem with my computer.
I can hear you.
Okay, all right. Well, clearly, listening to Joe articulate the arguments from Plato is really kind of a reminiscence itself. It takes one back to more golden times when there was a great deal of ferment in relation to Plato and Santa Barbara and the university and elsewhere, and in the Institute, by the way. So it was a delight to hear that. And Joe, I thought, was so deft at being able to bring out the arrogance, the aggressiveness, the insecurity of those who opposed Socrates, and help us see something of how that correlates with our own time and the temperament and the temper of our own time. And many of you have also put an accent on that in terms of the comments that you've made. It is, as Phil said, almost a religion, and you're dealing with something very, very difficult. But Joe, also, what I really appreciated about what Joe did was he was able to help us see something about Socrates as a complete individual, as a whole person, that allowed him to genuinely try to relate, to understand, to clarify, to articulate, and also to have a sense of humor. Because Socrates was clearly not concerned about winning an argument on an occasion. He was in for the long haul, so to speak. He was more willing to understand someone else's point of view than he was to convince them of his own. And I always love that quality about Joe, because he mentioned about being in that space where you can be an agnostic. And it reminds one that one can have a principle and be a person of principle, but that very point requires you to understand, to appreciate, to honor the relative truths in others and see the relative limitations in your own, as Joe pointed out. That gives a dignity to relative truth on both sides. And that shows the ubiquity of truth everywhere. And all of us have some aspect of that. And that, to me, also is the spirit of the Institute. We want to be able to present something with passion, conviction, but at the same time, have that spirit of genuineness, which seems to me what Joe's always talking about: genuineness, authenticity. That's more of propaganda than anything in the world. When someone senses you mean something, you're genuine, and you want to know what they really think, feel, and believe, however arrogant they might be, on the long run, that builds real friendship. So I think, Joe, as usual, you did something magnificent and magical. And we salute you for that, and we thank you for that.
Here, here. Thank you very much, Jim.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all agree with that. We just have a few closing comments here.
You want to take the video off? Yeah. Oh, hi, I'm Jonathan Colbert. I'm one of the board members of the Institute. I just wanted to call your attention to, well, since a lot of these events are online these days, to the worldculture.org website. It's all that much more relevant. And on there, you'll find upcoming events, a very special one of which I want to mention in a minute. You'll see a link to the study circle, or at least information on how to participate in it on Tuesday evenings. There's a link for how to make donations to the Institute. And there's information as to how to become a member of the Institute, should you wish to do that. And there's also, if you want to contact the Institute, you can email at Carolyn@worldculture.org or Jerry@worldculture.org. There's also links to the YouTube channel, the IWC YouTube channel. And fortunately, there's several presentations that are already posted on the YouTube channel. And this one will be posted too. And this was so powerful and potent, this presentation that Joe just gave. Can you imagine watching it several times and really unpacking it? So, and then just to mention, next week, only 7 days from today, on the 29th, it will be approaching the 74th death anniversary of Mohandas K. Gandhi, who was mentioned in this presentation. And 15 years ago, Nandini Iyer, who was one of the founders of the Institute, gave a presentation at the Faulkner Gallery on the subject of fearlessness on the path to nonviolence. And fortunately, some Promethean souls filmed that event. So we have the audio and the visual video of that occasion. And that will be shared via the YouTube channel. And so that the link for that will be on the worldculture.org website, as well as emailed out to all the members, of course. So that'll be an occasion, an opportunity to hear the voice of Nandini Iyer. Maybe some of you have never seen her or heard her before, but if you want to know what she was like, that will be a very special occasion. And she spoke about Gandhi in such an understanding and educated and wonderful way that I'm sure you will all enjoy that very much. So that'll be at, I believe it's at 2 o'clock a week from today. So thank you very much for your attendance. I guess the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, Joe, so much.
Well, do you want to take any more questions, Joe?
I'm here if somebody wants to talk. I mean, I'd like to hear anyone's comments who had something they wanted to say and didn't get the opportunity.
Well, Anthony did have a question, so this would give him a chance to ask it, and then Donna.
Yes, hello. I don't know if you can hear me. I know you can't see me. I have some difficulty here, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, all right. So what I wanted to ask was, in dialoguing in your day-to-day comings and goings with someone whose ideology or beliefs are diametrically opposed to you, and you want to dialogue with them for some reason and not just, not just walk away or just ignore them. If you, as you said, one technique would be to find similarities in their beliefs that you believed in, and you expressed that to them. Would this be, my question actually now, would this be a form of flattery?
I wouldn't, well, of course, if you weren't genuine, if you were, but I'm not talking about not being genuine. No, I think it would only be if if there's some traces. I mean, because not everyone is wholly good or wholly bad. And I think it challenges us to look beyond these monolithic categories that we frequently class people into. I think, from the Socratic perspective, we should be gaining a sense of ourselves as souls that are prior to differentiation and specialization in the bodies and personalities and political affinities, etc., that we belong to. And I mean, my own opinion is the more we can gain a sense of that there's something within another human being that is this basis of pure awareness prior to being specialized, like of course, the great metaphor is the white light gets, colored by the prism. So there is the idea is there is that one light. I think it's true that one can discipline oneself to see primarily that in another in another person and address that. But no, it wouldn't be flattery in the sense that Socrates is talking about imitations of the arts or sciences of outward health and inner health, which is what that metaphor was about. Creating imitations without the difficulties and discernment and will to follow through with the mental and moral disciplines and the bodily disciplines. We invent these imitations. So it's not that one wouldn't want to be insincere with someone, or to say that you believe them or support them with something that isn't in agreement. But we can almost always find, this is a Gandhian principle, that there's truth is what is real. Truth is sat. It's the basis of sattva. Truth is what is real, and there has to be, if a person is alive, there has to be some truth to them. Even if you talk about diet or modes of transportation or kinds of music they like. There's levels of commonality that have nothing to do with whatever it is that's dividing you. So I think it does, to me, it challenges me to think clearly about that voltage that I experience if I think, oh, they're other. I mean, it isn't that they're other. It's what about the thought I have that they're other? That's the problem. I'm being haunted by the way I've dug in my own heels to perceive them as other. Why don't I perceive them as the same? So a few thoughts.
Thank you very much for that answer. I do appreciate it very much indeed.
Donna, do you want to ask a question? If you do, you have to unmute.
Kind of follows on Anthony's question a little bit, but I was wondering what, so I think if I got this correctly, Nelson Mandela actually felt that you couldn't get anywhere with logic or reason when dealing with someone who had opposing views until you could connect emotionally, until you could break down the emotional barriers somewhat and allow for some truth or some, I'm actually wondering if this is some form of justice. Like, we may not feel we owe this person something to break down these barriers, but we do have responsibilities, greater responsibilities than we do to any particular individual. So, for instance, he, when he was dealing with the South African government and de Klerk, before he met with him, he spent a long time, he learned Afrikaner, the South African language. And he also, in meeting with de Klerk, learned about rugby because he knew he liked rugby. And he put a tremendous amount of time and energy into doing that. And so when they first met, that's what they talked about. And it had kind of a magical effect, and like an equalizing effect on a plane that transcended a little bit out of just raw kind of emotion. So I was kind of wondering about that notion of justice in that regard.
Could you elaborate a little bit? Would you say that Mandela was exercising a kind of justice in his quest to learn a little bit about de Klerk's interests? Is that?
Well, I was thinking about his efforts to be able to find a common ground. I was thinking of justice in terms, and I'm not sure I really even understand the term well, but the idea of remediation, where you try and bring some kind of harmony, some kind of, I'm not sure. I guess that's kind of what I'm asking a little bit. What is that when you try to break down an emotional barrier, understanding that without doing that first, you're not going to get anywhere logically or rationally with a person who is pretty confirmed in their beliefs? Is that an effort to practice a form of justice,
Mhm.
where we owe something to this situation. If we want something out of it, we owe something to it. And
No,
that's
good
probably
point.
very crude. I'm not sure, but
Good point. Good point.
I love that. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, you know, it also shows that, you know, in the real world, in our actual lives, persuasion is happening at all different levels, and it is rarely, in fact, simply some kind of purified Platonic rational affirmation. In fact, there's a lot of interesting research now that says that never happens. In Jonathan Haidt's books, you know, he points out these experiments they do where they show that, you know, people are persuaded by other things and their minds are made up long before they engage in what they experience as reason. But yes, I mean, I love that out of a powerful sense of justice, that one would feel a commitment or something they owe to the situation, which is what you said, that was to the circumstances, and then to be willing to put forth what is needed to pay that. That's a beautiful image. Thank you.
May I just read out a quote from Paine that I think throws some light on this whole problem?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is just a short quote. There never yet was any truth or any principle so irresistibly obvious that all men believed it at once. Time and reason must cooperate with each other to the final establishment of any principle.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
One last comment, and then we'll come to a close. Judy, did you have another
Oh.
comment?
Well, I hope this isn't changing the subject too much, but I wanted to ask Joe what he thinks of Martin Buber as a compassionate communicator. I think we could discuss that a little bit more, compassion and communication, because Buber realized as a professor, and he was also a rabbi, that at one point he hadn't really listened to a student who came to him to talk about philosophy, but the student had a serious problem and killed himself the next day. And he began to write about I-thou communication instead of looking at a person as a certain age, sex, color, religion, ethnicity. You try to look at the person as a thou. And even though this has a dualism in it, I think it's very powerful, because eventually it can get to we, and it can get to an important communication. It's been the basis for a lot of modern psychiatry. So I just wondered if you could comment on that in the context of what you
No,
said.
I don't really know very much about Buber, and I've heard you before kind of recap that, and that is very interesting. But I myself have not had much time to read Buber.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for the extra time. You get extra credit karmically.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific.
So we're gonna
Okay.
call it to a close. Thank you all for participating. It
Mhm.
certainly has been a
Bye-bye.
very rich
Thank you,
afternoon.
everyone. Thanks, Joe. See you
thank you,
soon.
Joe.
Thank you.